In the heart of the galaxy, there was a station so large that it seemed like a small world of its own. Thousands of ships came and went each day, carrying traders, merchants, travelers, and those who had nowhere else to go. The station was known as a place where anything could be bought or sold. Bright stalls were filled with glowing crystals, containers of rare minerals, machines from far-off systems, and strange food that gave off strong smells. The air was always filled with voices of many species, bargaining, shouting, and laughing. Lights flashed above the walkways, guiding crowds through endless rows of markets. Yet not every corner of the station was filled with joy and wealth. There was a place that most avoided, though it never stayed empty. This was the indenture market, a section where beings were put on display to be purchased as workers. Some were there because of debts they could never pay. Some were caught in wars, captured, and traded like goods. Others were simply unwanted refugees, stranded far from their home worlds. They were lined in cages or behind transparent walls, waiting to be sold to whoever had the credits. Among these rows of the forgotten sat a young alien girl. Her appearance did not make her stand out in any great way. Her body was thin, and her skin had faint cracks across it, like fragile porcelain that had been repaired many times. The faint glow of her eyes had dulled over the cycles she had been left there. Her hands rested quietly on her lap, and she kept her gaze low. She no longer tried to call out to passing buyers as she once had. Those days had long ended. When she had first arrived at the market, she had hoped someone might notice her. She had tried to show she could work, that she could learn, that she could be useful, but the traders only shook their heads. She was too weak, they said. Too small. Not worth the cost. Others around her were stronger, taller, brighter, or had skills bred into them. She was simply another face in the shadows. The market was busy that day. Traders shouted over one another, pointing to their strongest indentures, showing their skills with tools or heavy loads. Buyers walked past with calculating eyes, checking for strength, obedience, or beauty. Prices were called out, credits exchanged, and new contracts signed. Each sale meant another being was led away, their fate sealed for years or even a lifetime. The girl watched silently as others were taken, one by one. The cage beside her, once filled with a towering, scaled creature, now stood empty. Another, beside her, where a worker with extra arms had been kept, was also gone. She remained where she was, unmoving, unnoticed. Her trader barely gave her a glance. He had stopped trying to sell her, instead putting his energy into more profitable stock. Every so often he muttered that keeping her was a waste of space, but he did not release her either. She was just left there, forgotten, waiting for time to decide her end. As the cycles passed, she learned not to expect anything. Hope, she realized, was a heavy thing that only made the waiting harder. So she lowered her gaze whenever footsteps neared. She no longer spoke even when asked. To her, the market had become a long, endless silence. The noise around her grew louder as the day went on. She could hear buyers haggling over the price of a strong miner. Others argued over a singer with a voice that carried strange harmonies. All the while, she sat in the background, invisible in plain sight. The air felt heavy with the scent of metal and sweat, and the heat of the lights above pressed down on her fragile frame. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the muffled echoes of voices bouncing off the market walls. She wondered if this was how it would always be until her body gave up. Perhaps no one would ever know her name, or even care that she had once existed, but deep inside her, a small part of her refused to vanish completely. Though she no longer called out or begged, a tiny spark of her spirit still waited for something, anything, to change. And far away, moving slowly through the bustling market, a human had just stepped into that world of noise and shadows. He walked with steady steps, ignoring the flashing lights and the traders trying to pull him toward their stalls. His eyes moved calmly from one side to the other, as if he were searching for something the others had missed. The girl did not know it yet, but her silence was about to be broken. The human walked through the market with a calmness that seemed out of place. Most buyers came with loud voices, flashing their wealth and showing their authority. But he carried himself differently. His steps were slow, measured, and his eyes looked not at the stalls filled with shining goods but at the people. Many traders noticed him and tried to pull him closer. They waved their hands, showing him tall workers bred for strength, or performers whose voices filled the air with melody. But the human gave only brief glances before moving on. He was not tall compared to some of the other species around him. Many towered above him with heavy arms or glowing scales. Yet when he passed by, others moved aside as though something about him demanded space. Perhaps it was his steady gaze, or the way his presence was quiet but firm, like a mountain that would not move even if storms passed around it. The girl in the cage had her head lowered, her eyes half closed. She did not notice him at first, not until his shadow stretched across the bars in front of her. Slowly, she lifted her gaze, expecting to see yet another buyer who would take one look at her and walk away. But this time the stranger did not walk away. He stopped and stood in front of her cage. His eyes, a clear and piercing shade, studied her carefully. He did not laugh as others had. He did not sneer or dismiss her with a wave of his hand. Instead, he crouched down, bringing himself to her level as though he wished to meet her eyes without forcing her to look up. The girl blinked in confusion. She had forgotten what it felt like to be seen. The silence between them lasted longer than she expected, and it unsettled her. Finally, she lowered her gaze again, whispering in a voice so soft it nearly broke apart. "I am not strong." The human tilted his head slightly, but he did not answer right away. He did not speak to her as though she were a thing. Instead, he asked gently, "What is your name?" The question startled her. No one had asked for her name since she had been brought to the market. For a moment she thought of not answering, afraid it might be a cruel trick. But something in his voice felt different, steady and without mockery. Her lips trembled as she whispered her name. It felt strange leaving her mouth, as though she had pulled it from somewhere long buried. Before she could think further, the trader in charge of her cage walked over, smirking. "You do not want that one, human. She is worthless. A waste of credits. Too weak to lift. Too shy to speak. No one has bought her, not in cycles." He laughed loudly, hoping to embarrass the human into moving on. But the human did not laugh. He stood and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small device filled with credits. "How much?" His tone was calm, but it carried a weight that silenced the laughter around him. The trader blinked, then scoffed. "I can give you better ones, look here." He gestured to a larger cage filled with strong, muscular workers. "These are worth your credits." "Why waste them on this broken shell?" I asked. The human said again, "How much?" The trader frowned, realizing he would get no upsell from this buyer. With a shrug, he named a small price, barely more than the cost of food in the upper levels of the station. To him, the sale was not worth the time, but better than keeping her any longer. He held out the ownership chip. The human handed him the credits without another word, then turned back to the girl. The trader muttered under his breath, shaking his head as he walked away. Other merchants nearby whispered to one another, confused at the human's choice. Some laughed, others simply shrugged, deciding he was strange and not worth the thought. The girl, however, sat frozen. She could not understand what had just happened. She had been ignored for so long, treated as less than nothing. Now this stranger had given away his credits for her when he could have chosen anyone else. She stared at him, her voice shaky. "Why me?" The human looked at her with the same calm eyes and said simply, "Because you deserve better than a cage." Her heart jolted at those words. She had imagined freedom in her dreams, but those dreams always faded when she woke to the sound of traders shouting prices. To hear someone speak to her as though she were more than a number, it was almost too much to believe. Slowly, the human reached forward and pressed the button to open the cage. The door slid aside with a quiet hum. He did not pull her out or force her to move. He only stepped back, giving her space to decide. The girl looked from the open door to him and then back again. Her body trembled, torn between fear and hope. For the first time in her life within the market, she realized the choice was hers. The girl did not move at first. The open cage door felt like a trick. Many times she had imagined what freedom would look like, but never had she thought it would come so suddenly, so simply. She kept her hands on her lap and her gaze fixed on the human, trying to read the truth in his calm face. The market noise continued all around them. Traders shouted, buyers bargained, and the air was filled with the sound of credits being exchanged. Yet for her, everything seemed strangely quiet. The open door was like a line between two worlds. Behind her was the cage she had known for so long, and in front of her was something she could not yet name. The human did not rush her. He stood with steady patience, as though he understood how heavy the moment was for her. His presence was not demanding, but protective, like a shield against the voices that mocked or doubted. Finally, with shaky steps, she moved forward. One hand touched the edge of the cage, and then she pulled herself outside. The air beyond the bars felt different, lighter, as though she had stepped into a space where she was no longer invisible. Her legs trembled, but she forced herself to stand. The human gave her a small nod, then without a word he took the ownership chip and crushed it in his hand. Sparks flickered as the device broke into pieces. Gasps rose from a few who saw it. Destroying such a chip was against the rules of the hub. Indentures were meant to remain bound by contracts, not freed by buyers. But the human did not seem to care. He let the broken pieces fall to the ground and turned to her. "You are free now," he said. The words hit her harder than she expected. Free. She had longed to hear that word, but it felt almost dangerous. She whispered back, her voice barely audible. "Free? But where can I go?" "That is for you to decide," he answered. "You may follow me or walk your own path. The choice is yours." Her heart raced. To walk away alone meant facing a world she no longer understood. To stay meant trusting someone she had only just met. She looked into his eyes and saw no judgment, no mockery, only calm resolve. Slowly, she stepped closer to him. The human gave a faint smile and led her through the market. The traders around them whispered and laughed. Some shook their heads, calling him foolish for wasting credits on broken stock. Others muttered about the danger of breaking rules. Yet the human walked on as if their voices did not exist. The girl kept close behind him, her steps unsure but growing stronger with each pace. As they passed one stall, a merchant called out mockingly, "Human! When that one collapses, don't come crying back for a refund." The others nearby laughed. The girl felt heat rush to her cheeks, shame tightening in her chest. She wanted to hide, to disappear. But the human only glanced at the merchant with steady eyes and said, "Some things cannot be measured in credits." Then he kept walking. The laughter faded behind them, replaced by the hum of other voices. The girl looked at him with quiet surprise. No one had ever spoken for her before, not like that. She had always been the one others pitied, mocked, or ignored. For the first time, she felt a faint spark of dignity return, like a small fire struggling to burn after being smothered for too long. They reached a quieter part of the station, where the noise of the market dimmed. Here the walkways were wider and the lights glowed softer. The human finally stopped and turned to her. "What do you need right now?" he asked. The question was strange to her. Needs were not something she had been asked about. Needs were things others decided for her, things given or taken at their will. She hesitated, then whispered, "Water." Without a word, he guided her toward a stall where clean water was sold. He bought a flask and handed it to her. She held it carefully, as though it were a treasure. The cool taste filled her throat and tears stung her eyes. Such a simple act, and yet it felt like kindness she had not known in so long. As she drank, she looked at the human again. Questions crowded her mind. Why had he chosen her? What did he see that no one else did? Did he truly expect nothing in return? The mystery of his choice unsettled her, but at the same time it gave her a fragile hope. The human seemed to notice her struggle. "You don't have to understand everything right away," he said softly. "For now, it is enough that you are no longer in a cage." His words echoed inside her, wrapping around that small spark within her heart. She realized that while her body had been trapped, the heavier chains had been inside her spirit. For the first time in so long, she felt them begin to loosen. Yet, somewhere in the depths of the market, traders muttered angrily about the human's actions. Some saw his defiance as an insult, a challenge to the way things had always been. Though the girl could not yet see it, her freedom was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of something larger, something dangerous. But in that moment, as she walked beside him, she felt the faint touch of hope, and hope, even in its smallest form, was more powerful than chains. The walk through the quieter halls of the station felt strange to the girl. For so long, her world had been no bigger than the metal bars of a cage. Now each step carried her into something new and unfamiliar. The lights overhead seemed brighter, the air less heavy, and the sounds less harsh. Yet with every step, a voice in her heart whispered that it could not last. Freedom, she feared, was a fragile thing, easily broken. The human walked beside her with calm steadiness, showing no sign of worry. His presence gave her a kind of shield, though she did not understand how someone so plain-looking compared to the towering aliens around them could make others step aside. He moved as if he belonged everywhere, and his confidence made the path easier for her to follow. But not everyone was willing to ignore what had just happened. In the market behind them, traders gathered in small groups, whispering and frowning. The breaking of the ownership chip had not gone unnoticed. It was more than strange, it was against the rules of the hub. To free an indenture was to insult the system that kept the market alive. For traders, it was not only about one girl, it was about order, about power, and about credits that might be lost if others followed the example. Rumors spread quickly. By the time the human and the girl had reached a rest area filled with quiet benches and rows of glowing plants, more than one trader had already contacted the enforcers. Soon the whispers grew sharper. A human had bought a worthless indenture only to free her, destroying the chip. It was foolish, dangerous, and above all, disruptive. The girl sat on the edge of a bench, her hands clutching the flask of water he had given her earlier. She still could not understand why he had chosen her. Her voice trembled when she finally spoke. "They will be angry. I have heard the traders before. They do not forgive when their rules are broken." The human sat across from her, leaning forward slightly. His eyes were calm yet firm. "Let them be angry," he said. "Their anger cannot put you back in a cage unless you allow it." His words confused her. She had never thought of herself as someone who could allow or prevent anything. In the market, choice had been a dream too far to reach. She lowered her gaze, whispering, "I am not strong. I cannot fight them." The human shook his head. "Strength is not only in muscle. Sometimes it is in refusing to bow when others demand it. You have already shown strength by stepping out of that cage." Her heart fluttered at his words. Could that truly be called strength? To her, it had felt like trembling, like barely standing against the weight of her fear. Yet the way he said it made her wonder if perhaps there was more inside her than she had ever believed. Before she could answer, a sharp voice broke through the calm. "You there? Human." The girl froze, clutching the flask tightly. From the far side of the walkway, 3 enforcers approached. They were broad-shouldered beings in dark uniforms, their faces covered by helmets that glowed faintly at the edges. Each carried a baton that hummed with quiet energy. The human did not move. He turned his head to meet them, his expression unreadable. The lead enforcer spoke again. "You destroyed a registered indenture chip. That is a violation of hub law. The girl is still property of the market until reviewed by the council. Return her, and you may leave without penalty." The girl's breath caught in her throat. She had known this would happen. She had known freedom was too fragile to last. Her hands shook as she looked at the human, afraid he would give in, afraid he would hand her back just to avoid trouble. But the human stood slowly, facing the enforcers. His voice was calm but carried weight. "She is no one's property. The chip is gone and she will not return to a cage." The enforcers shifted uneasily. Few ever spoke so directly to them. The lead officer narrowed his eyes. You risk more than you understand, human. This hub does not tolerate disruptions. The human did not back away. Then perhaps it is the hub that does not understand. The words hung in the air like a challenge. The girl's heart pounded as she waited for the enforcers to strike. But after a long pause, the lead officer gave a sharp gesture, and the group turned away. It was not fear that stopped them, but uncertainty. There was something in the human's defiance they could not measure, something that unsettled them more than his crime. When they were gone, the girl released a shaky breath. They will come back, she whispered. Yes, the human said. But now you know. You are not alone. His words sank deep into her. For so long, she had believed she was invisible, forgotten, powerless. Now, even with danger rising around them, she felt a small flame of courage flicker to life inside her. Yet in the shadows of the hub, the traitors gathered again. Plans were whispered, and threats were formed. They would not let a human break their order so easily. The girl did not know it yet, but the act of stepping out of her cage had started a storm that would sweep through more than just the market. The hub was never a quiet place, but now its noise carried something sharper. Rumors spread faster than ships through open space. The story of the human who freed an indenture traveled from stall to stall, from trader to trader. At first, many laughed at it, calling him a fool. But as the tale repeated, laughter turned into whispers of worry. If one person could break the system so openly, what would stop others from doing the same? The girl stayed close to the human, her steps light but her heart heavy. She felt the stares following them wherever they went. In the food hall, merchants paused in mid-sentence to glare. On the walkways, groups muttered as they passed. Even in the resting areas, silence fell when the human sat down, only to rise again in hushed conversations once he left. She had thought freedom would bring peace, but instead it felt like stepping into a storm. Her hands shook when she lifted her drink, and her eyes darted at every shadow. More than once she thought of running, of disappearing before she caused him more trouble. Yet each time he noticed her fear and spoke a few calm words. You are not a burden. They are the ones afraid, not you. But she knew the danger was growing. The traitors were not the type to let insults fade. They thrived on order, and the human had broken it. The backlash began with words. At the market, some traders shouted openly when he passed. "Rule breaker," one cried. Another sneered. "Enjoy your pet while you can, human. The hub will not protect you." Their voices carried through the crowds, and the girl lowered her head in shame. But the human did not flinch. He walked with steady steps, his silence louder than their anger. Soon words turned into action. At one stall, a merchant refused to sell to him, declaring that his credits were no good there. At another, the price for water was raised 3 times higher. Everywhere they went, doors began to close. The hub was pressing against him, trying to push him out, but he did not bend. Instead, he found quieter stalls, smaller shops, where kind eyes still lingered despite the risk. Some watched him with curiosity, even respect, though they dared not speak it aloud. The girl noticed these silent glances. It was strange. For every angry face, there was another that carried a spark of wonder. It was as if people were asking themselves a question they had never dared to think before. What if the system could be broken? One evening, as the lights dimmed to signal rest hours, they found a place to sit near a wide glass wall that showed the stars outside. The endless black was dotted with lights of ships coming and going, each one a story of its own. The girl sat beside him, hugging her knees. Her voice trembled when she spoke. "You should not have chosen me. Now they will come for you." The human looked at the stars for a long moment before answering. "Perhaps. But it was not about choosing you. It was about refusing them." She frowned softly. "Refusing them? They live by chains," he said. "Not only for others, but for themselves. They cannot imagine a life without control. By breaking one chain, you showed that their system is not unshakable. That frightens them more than any weapon." His words made her chest tighten. She had always seen herself as weak, useless, easy to ignore, but he spoke as if she carried something powerful, something that even frightened the ones who had ruled over her. Yet his calm could not erase the truth. The danger was near. The next day, enforcers came again. This time not just to warn, but to question. They asked for his identification, his purpose on the hub, his ship registry. The human gave answers without fear, his tone steady and clear. The girl stood behind him, clutching the folds of her clothes, trembling as the officer's sharp eyes studied her. She expected chains to be placed back on her neck, but it never happened. The officers left with hard expressions promising to return. As they disappeared, the girl whispered, "Why do you not yield? It would be easier." "Because yielding," the human said, "is another word for surrender. And humans do not surrender so easily." His voice carried a quiet fire, and for a moment she believed him fully. But in the hidden corners of the hub, traders were no longer content with sending enforcers. They gathered in dark halls, speaking in low voices. The human was a problem, one that threatened their profits and their control. Words would not silence him. Laws would not bend him. If the system could not hold him, then force would. Plans were made in whispers. Mercenaries were called. Paths were marked. The girl could not hear these things, but she felt the weight of them pressing against her heart. She had stepped out of a cage only to walk into something larger, something that might swallow both of them whole. Yet even as fear clawed at her, she could not bring herself to leave his side. For the first time in her life, someone had stood for her, and though she did not yet understand it, standing with him might be the only way to hold on to the fragile flame of freedom she had been given. The hub seemed to grow colder with each passing cycle. The girl noticed it first in the silence. Where there had once been laughter and shouts in the markets, now there were pauses and glances when she and the human walked past. Traders no longer bothered to mock openly. Instead, they whispered to one another, their eyes narrowing with quiet anger. The air felt heavier, filled with something waiting to break. The human seemed to sense it too. He moved with the same calm steps, but his gaze was sharper now, scanning every corner and every shadow. The girl followed close beside him, her hands always clenched tightly together. She wanted to believe that his presence was enough to protect her, but a knot of fear twisted in her chest. She knew too well how far the traders would go to protect their power. That night, when the hub's lights dimmed to the pale glow of rest, the storm finally came. The human had led her through a quiet alleyway, away from the noise of the larger walkways. It was lined with metal crates and flickering lamps, a place where the air smelled of rust and oil. She felt uneasy as soon as they entered. The silence here was too perfect, too deliberate. Then, from the shadows, figures stepped out. There were 6 of them, mercenaries hired by the traders. Their armor was patched but strong, their weapons humming faintly in the dim light. The girl's breath caught in her throat as they spread out, blocking the path ahead and behind. One of them, a tall being with heavy plates along his arms, sneered. "Human, the traders are done with your games. You will hand the girl over and perhaps we let you walk away." The girl's knees shook. She knew this was the end. She had seen mercenaries before, and she knew how quickly they could crush anything in their way. She turned to the human, expecting him to falter, to surrender, but he did not. He stood tall, his shoulders straight, his face calm. "She is free," he said firmly. "I will not hand her back." The mercenaries laughed, their voices echoing through the alley. "Then you are a fool," the leader said. He raised his weapon. "And you will pay for it." The girl closed her eyes, bracing for the blow. But when the sound came, it was not the strike she expected. Instead, she heard the clang of metal, the scrape of boots on the ground, and the sudden shouts of surprise. She opened her eyes and saw the human move with startling speed. He did not have armor or advanced weapons, only his bare hands and a small tool he had hidden in his jacket. Yet he fought with a sharpness she had never seen. When one mercenary, swung his baton. The human ducked low, pulling the girl aside before using the attacker's own momentum to throw him into a wall. Another lunged forward, but the human struck with precision, forcing the weapon to drop with a crack of sparks. The girl watched in shock. He was not stronger than them, not larger, but he used every detail of the alley, the crates, the shadows, the narrow space, to his advantage. He pulled down a hanging pipe to block one attacker, kicked a crate into the legs of another, and kept moving, never giving them the chance to surround him fully. His determination seemed endless, as if his body refused to quit even when struck. The mercenaries grew frustrated. They were used to enemies breaking quickly under their power, but this human did not bend. His eyes burned with a fire that unsettled even those who towered over him. Each time he was knocked back, he rose again, his stance firm, his will unbroken. The girl's fear shifted into something new. She had thought of him as calm and steady, but now she saw the other side of him, unyielding, fierce, and unafraid of standing against odds that should have crushed him. It was not brute strength that carried him, but something deeper, something that made the mercenaries hesitate. Finally, after a long clash of strikes and shouts, the mercenaries faltered. One by one they pulled back, nursing bruises and burns, their weapons dented. Their leader glared at the human with narrowed eyes. "This is not over," he spat, before giving the order to retreat. The shadows swallowed them again, leaving the alley in uneasy silence. The girl stood frozen, her breath coming in quick gasps. The human wiped a cut from his forehead, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths, but his eyes were still steady. He looked at her, not with pride or arrogance, but with calm reassurance. "You're safe," he said quietly. Her voice shook as she answered. "Why? Why fight for me like this? You could have walked away." The human gave a faint, tired smile. "Because some things are worth fighting for, and you are one of them." Her heart tightened at his words. She had always believed she was worthless, too weak to matter. Yet he stood against mercenaries, risked his life, and still looked at her as though she carried value greater than credits or chains. For the first time in her life, she felt something stronger than fear. She felt respect, and a fragile but growing belief that perhaps she was not as powerless as she had always thought. But even as that spark grew, she knew the storm was not finished. The mercenaries would return, and the traitors would not stop. The fight in the alley was only a glimpse of what was coming. Yet now, standing beside the human, she felt a new kind of courage, the kind that came from knowing she was no longer facing the storm alone. The hub did not forget the fight in the alley. Rumors spread faster than traitors could silence them. Workers whispered about the human who stood against mercenaries with nothing but his will and his hands. Others spoke of the girl, no longer quiet and hidden, but walking beside him as though she belonged to the light instead of the shadows. At first, many doubted. They said it was impossible, that one human could not turn back a pack of hired fighters. Yet the bruised mercenaries nursed their wounds in silence, and their silence spoke louder than any denial. Eyes began to follow the girl differently now. Where there had once been scorn or indifference, there was a quiet respect, or at the very least a wary recognition that she was no longer invisible. The girl felt the change too. She still carried fear in her chest, but it no longer ruled her steps. When she walked with the human, she lifted her head a little higher. When she spoke, her voice did not break as easily. For so long she had believed herself weak and useless, a burden better left forgotten. But each time she remembered how he stood between her and the mercenaries, each time she heard his calm words, "You are worth fighting for," something inside her grew stronger. The human noticed the change but said little. He continued to guide her through the crowded walkways, teaching her how to move without being cornered, how to listen for danger, and how to speak so her voice carried weight. He was not gentle in his lessons, but he was patient. When she faltered, he made her try again. When she doubted herself, he reminded her that survival was not just about being protected, but about learning to stand. Days turned into weeks, and the traitors grew restless. Their whispers hardened into anger. The girl was meant to be broken, a forgotten piece of property that no one cared for. Now she was a symbol, however small, that one could resist. The human had unsettled the balance they had controlled for years, and the traders could not allow that. One evening, as the markets buzzed with activity, the traders tried a new tactic. Instead of sending mercenaries, they sent words. A speaker stood on a raised platform, his voice booming across the crowd. He mocked the human, calling him reckless, calling him dangerous. He warned the people that if they followed such defiance, the hub would descend into chaos. The girl stood in the crowd, her fists clenched, her stomach twisting with anger. She expected the human to step forward, to argue, to fight with words as he had with his hands. But he did not. Instead, he looked at her. "This is your turn," he said quietly. Her heart pounded. She wanted to shake her head, to hide behind him as she always had. But his eyes were steady, filled with the same fire she had seen in the alley. And she understood. He was not abandoning her. He was giving her a chance to rise. With trembling steps, she climbed onto the platform. The crowd fell into a hush. She felt every stare press against her skin, the weight of hundreds of eyes that had once ignored her. For a moment, fear nearly crushed her voice. But then she remembered the words he had given her. She remembered how he had faced 6 mercenaries and had not broken. She drew a breath, and she spoke. "I was nothing to you," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "You sold me, you mocked me, you treated me as less than dirt. But I am still here. I live. I walk free, and I will not bow again." A ripple moved through the crowd. Some gasped, some muttered angrily, but others straightened, as if a weight had lifted from their shoulders. Workers who had been silent too long, servants who had learned to keep their heads low. They heard her words and felt them strike something deep inside. The speaker shouted back, his voice full of fury. "You are nothing without our permission. You are weak. You cannot stand against us." The girl's voice rose louder than before. "Maybe I am weak, but I am not alone. And weakness does not mean worthless." She looked toward the human, who stood calmly at the edge of the crowd, because even the smallest voice can grow if someone believes it matters. Silence followed. Then, slowly, a few claps began. One worker, then another, then more. Soon the sound grew, filling the market with a rhythm stronger than the speaker's anger. The traders' faces twisted with rage, but they could not silence the sound. The girl stood tall, her fear still burning inside her, but no longer in control. That night, as they walked away from the crowd, the girl felt a new weight on her shoulders. But this time it was not the weight of chains. It was the weight of responsibility, of being seen, of having spoken words that others would not forget. She looked at the human, her voice quiet. "I don't know if I'm ready for this." He gave a small smile. "No one ever is. But you're ready enough to begin." The girl looked back toward the hub where shadows still lingered and danger still brewed. Yet for the first time, she did not see only fear. She saw possibility. She saw a path she had never believed existed. And she walked forward, not as someone ignored, but as someone who had been heard.